Congressional staff, there are a couple seats up here in the front row, two to be specific. I'm going to introduce our sponsoring organizations in just a moment, but I wanted to just give you a background of the involvement of Friends of the Earth over the past 3 decades in dealing with the tax code, because we think the fundamental task has to be to decarbonize our tax code, and that consists not only in looking at a carbon tax, but also in taking care of the large number of subsidies that are buried in the tax code that reward and encourage fossil fuel investments. Our work on the tax code goes back into the 1980s. We were the organization in the 1986 tax code that urged elimination of the third home mortgage deduction. If you had a third home, now after that passed, you can no longer write that one off. We also, in the 90s, looked at the fact that employers could provide unlimited free parking as a tax-free fringe benefit. And yet, if you were walking or taking transit, you were capped at $20 a month. And we narrowed that gap. At that time, we put the transit benefits up to $60 a month and brought down the amount from unlimited to $160. Still a disparity, still a discrimination against public transit and those who wish to walk or bicycle to work. But that is illustration of how, over time, you can be tackling the tax code. That the tax committees are something that the environmental movement should not run away from, because taxes are a fundamental civic responsibility. And our tax code right now predominantly is rewarding the extraction and pollution of the past. This has been the history, and it ought to be rewarding the something different, and something which Congressman Larson referred to. We ought to be rewarding goods and taxing the bads, the pollution. And when we did a report in 1998, the public responded to the idea of changing taxes from taxing things that we want to encourage and putting the taxes on things like pollution. They thought they were a sin tax, and that was good. They liked that idea. And we intend to pursue this further, and today's discussion from these distinguished panelists is going to, I think, open many eyes, and I believe convince you of the potency of looking at the national carbon tax. This is, of course, one of a number of things we urgently need to do to deal with climate disruption and destabilization. We have to, in particular, cap emissions, and we need to get really significant performance standards. And think also of the carbon tax in these terms. We have now come through several decades of hearing how evil government is. We have to deregulate everything, privatize everything, and you have the collapse of governmental institutions, and now the government is being run to as out of desperation for relief. A carbon tax is one way of funding the functions of government and putting government back in terms of the kind of responsibility that I think is envisioned in the Constitution. There are certain basic duties that need to be carried out. So Friends of the Earth is in support of that. Now let me turn to acknowledge our sponsors here. We have the Environment and Energy Study Institute, which has been in existence since 1984 and has sponsored so many influential briefings to educate the public and members of Congress about energy and environmental issues. Carol Warner and Laura Parsons, would you stand up here and be recognized? There you are. Okay. And then I want to recognize the Carbon Tax Center, which has really, over the past 2 years, energized the public in terms of the potential of carbon taxes. And let me ask the people there, Charlie Komanoff, Dan Rosenblum, James Hanley, please stand up there, and Reed Capolino. And then next, the Climate Crisis Coalition, which since 2003 has been mobilizing to combine issues of social responsibility, economics, and the urgency of getting rapid action on climate change. And Tom Stokes, Ezra Small, Steve Kent, and Father Paul Meyer, if you would all stand up and be acknowledged as well. And finally, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. I don't know if we have a representative. Yes, thank you. Now, to kick this off, we have the distinguished scientist, Dr. James Hansen, director of NASA's Space Institute in New York City, professor at Columbia University, and in some sense the father and catalyst of sparking congressional interest and broad public interest. And he's going to lead us off.
Thanks very much. I should note that anything that I say that relates to policy is my personal opinion. I'm not representing a government agency in that regard. I do want to draw attention to this large gap that exists between what is understood by the relevant scientific community and what is known about the climate problem, global warming, by the public and the people who need to know, the public and policymakers. And the fact is, and this is what the policymakers are going to need to understand, we have reached a point of a planetary emergency. And the reason that can be, even though you don't see that much, if you go outside, the weather fluctuations are much larger than global warming. But in fact, there's more global warming in the pipeline because of the inertia of the climate system. And the climate system has tipping points. And if we push the system beyond them, you begin to get large changes, and we can lose control of the system. And the bad news is that the dangerous level of atmospheric carbon dioxide is actually, we've already passed that level. And that really is going to make a very difficult problem. And it's that, and I think my suggestion, one of the things that I would suggest to the new president is that he ask the National Academy of Sciences to make a very clear report on this, because it has become very clear to the relevant scientific community that, in fact, it is a very urgent problem. And as I say, it's not easy for the person in the street to see that, but the science has become very clear. And the United States has agreed to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which says we should stabilize our emissions and atmospheric composition at a level that avoids the dangerous effects. And I want to quickly go through a few charts because I want to get to the tax and dividend and to save time for that. But we see, for example, the Arctic sea ice is beginning to disappear. We've lost almost half of it in the summer. If we wanted to stabilize the Arctic sea ice, we would need to decrease the atmospheric CO2 to something like 325 to 350 parts per million. It's now 385 parts per million. There's more melting of ice on Greenland and Antarctica, and that is leading to the meltwater is leading to the discharge of giant icebergs and therefore the loss of mass. Greenland is losing mass at a rate of about 200 cubic kilometers per year, and West Antarctica at a rate at about half that. The subtropics are expanding, which is affecting the southern United States and Mediterranean region, Australia, and parts of Africa, and that is having effects such as increasing the forest fires, which have increased by a factor of 4 over the last few decades. Mountain glaciers all around the world are melting back, and that affects the fresh water supply for hundreds of millions of people. The rivers that originate in the Himalayas and the Rockies and the Andes Mountains. Once those glaciers are gone, which they will be within less than 50 years if we stay on business as usual, then those rivers will tend to run dry in the summer and fall. And so that will have enormous impacts. Coral reefs are under stress for several reasons, but two of them are the increased carbon dioxide in the ocean water, which makes the ocean more acid, which affects carbonate, those species that have carbonate shells or carbonate skeletons. And 1/3 of the species in the ocean are associated with these coral reefs. So anyway, there are many different effects, all of which tell us that if we want to maintain these systems, we would have to decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere to an amount less than the present 385 parts per million. And the problem is that, and it turns out that carbon dioxide is the real problem. There are other things we're doing. There are other gases that we're adding to the atmosphere, other things we're doing that affect the climate. But the carbon dioxide is the main issue because of its long lifetime. And on the long run, it's going to be the dominant effect. The reason is that when we put a pulse of CO2 into the atmosphere, it begins to disappear quickly, so that after 25 years, half of it is gone. But then, and mostly going into the ocean. But then the ocean resists taking up the rest of it, because the CO2 can come back out of the ocean, and until the CO2 in the ocean is deposited as sediments on the ocean floor, it will not take up the rest of the CO2. So that after 1,000 years, about 1/5 of it is still in the atmosphere. So the upshot of that is that we cannot burn all the fossil fuels. So in general, what in this few comments about the science, I want to make clear this information is not coming from climate models. It's coming from from two things: observations of what's happening already with the changes that we've made to the atmosphere, and secondly, improved understanding of the Earth's history, which shows us how the Earth responded in the past to changes in the boundary conditions, such as atmospheric composition. And what that tells us, if we were to increase carbon dioxide to 500 parts per million, if we were to burn all the fossil fuels, we would increase carbon dioxide to 600 or 800 parts per million. The eventual response of the Earth to that would be melting all the ice on the planet. The last time the CO2 was more than 450 parts per million, there was no ice on the planet, and sea level was 75 meters higher. So it's clear, it takes a while for the ice sheets to respond, but it's clear that we cannot burn all the fossil fuels, or we will push the planet back to where it was when those gases were in the atmosphere before, which is a completely different planet. And the problem is, this bar chart shows that the oil, gas, and coal, which are the three fossil fuel sources of carbon dioxide. The oil, we've probably used about half of it already, but the huge potential source is coal. And in fact, coal is already the source of as much atmospheric carbon dioxide as oil and gas combined. So if we want to keep carbon dioxide from increasing to large values and begin to get it to decrease, we need to phase out coal over the next couple of decades. But the other thing that's needed in order to move us to the era beyond fossil fuels, because we're going to have to move to energy sources beyond fossil fuels anyhow at some time. As I said, in the case of oil, we're already getting close to peak oil. But we're going to have to do that faster if we want to avoid climate disasters. And I think the way that you have to do that is by putting a price on those emissions. We're going to have a rising price on carbon emissions. And what I'd like to make clear is you can't do it by means of goals for emission reduction, percentage goals, or, in my opinion, by cap and trade, because that is basically the Kyoto Protocol approach. And if you look at that, it doesn't work. The country that was most, took the strongest position on that, most aggressive targets, was Japan. And they pride themselves on their fact that they've made themselves the most energy efficient nation in the world. And yet, if you look at their emissions, they actually increased substantially. Their coal use increased substantially. Well, how did they do that? They bought out. There's a clean development mechanism, so they purchased a right to pollute. But that was supposed to reduce the emissions where they purchased those rights, in China. But China's emissions shot up exponentially. So that doesn't work. You have to look at the geophysical facts, where these emissions are coming from. And coal is the large potential source, which is going to have to be terminated. If you're going to either have to leave the coal in the ground or else use it only where you capture the CO2 and sequester it. But also, we've got to avoid turning to a fourth source, which I didn't even show on my chart, and that's the unconventional fossil fuels. Tar shale, oil shale, tar sands, because those potentially have as much carbon dioxide as coal. We simply cannot exploit those, and that's not yet understood. There are people who are beginning to rev up to exploit those resources, but we can't do that. And the way to avoid that, I think, is a carbon tax. And the way to make a carbon tax work is to give 100% dividend. You have to give the money back to the public on a per capita basis. And that way stimulate the transition to a fossil fuel-less future. The tax is going to need to be substantial, and the public and businesses are going to need to understand that it's going to be increasing in the future. But if the tax is returned 100% to the public on an equal per capita basis and deposited in their bank accounts monthly, then they will be able to see the person who does better than average in reducing his carbon emissions will actually make money. They will get more money back in the dividend than they pay in the taxes. And I think a payroll tax would not work as well, because not everybody's on a payroll, and especially in these times. There are a lot of unemployed people, and it's an opportunity for them. They can save carbon emissions just as well as anybody else, and they'll be paying attention to that. And the government role, you don't want a complicated cap and dividend where you start employing thousands of people and you get people making millions of dollars. And that's exactly what the public will rebel against. A tax is simple. It doesn't require any new bureaucracy. You just you apply it at the point, at the wellhead or at the point of entry as the fossil fuel comes into the country. And so it's very simple, and the dividend just requires long division. You divide the total tax by the number of recipients, and each one gets an equal share. And it can be given to them immediately. And the government should keep their hands off that money. It should not be the government deciding, oh, I'm going to invest this in a green energy, because they can't choose the most effective green energy. Nobody knows what's going to be the energy sources of the future. Let the marketplace decide that, and the public will have the money to invest in those things which save the emissions. And actually, the first one will be energy efficiency. We can save enormous amount in energy efficiency. And so I think that I think this needs to be explained to the public, and that's what I hope. If the government would decide to do this, I think the president would be the ideal person to explain this to the public, and the public needs to insist that they get 100% of the money, that it not go to lobbyists, because the way it works with a cap and trade system and others, you'll have lobbyists arguing for how that will work. And we don't need lobbyists if we have a simple tax and dividend system. Okay. Yeah, let me tell you one more example. I went to Germany to try to convince the German government that they should not build 20 new coal-fired power plants. And the environmental minister told me, well, we're going to have cap and trade. That's how we will solve the problem. But if you have new coal-fired power plants putting CO2 in the atmosphere, there's no way that you're going to solve the... We've got to drive down the emissions rapidly over the next few decades. Those coal-fired power plants will be there for a long, long time. So that's just, politically, that's convenient for people to take that position, but it's not going to solve the problem. And how can you make the system work internationally? If you have a cap and trade, you've got to convince other countries to do something similar. In the case of a carbon tax, if China says they don't want to have a carbon tax, they actually will see the wisdom of it also, because they don't want to have the dependence on fossil fuels that we have. So they're going to want to drive down their fossil fuel requirements. But if, let's say they said, no, we're not going to have a carbon tax, then what do? The products that come in from China, you put an import duty on those equivalent to the tax, depending on the amount of fossil fuels that go into the making of that product. And then you would be collecting their tax for them, and you could give it as dividend to your citizens or invest it in your own country. So they would quickly decide that they're going to have a carbon tax. And as the congressman said, this is something that you could start immediately. Not a cap and trade thing will take you years to try to figure that out, and basically there will be a lot of people making money on it, but the system won't be as effective. There were a couple of other things I wanted to say about this. Well, maybe they'll come up in the discussion, but I think I'll stop at this point.